Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Hello once more. Welcome back to Scandalous Tales from the Australian Bar with me, Phil Craig. And hello to all newcomers, and I think we have some. Last week's show, which was mostly about me promoting this little masterpiece. Well, it's not for me to say it's a masterpiece, of course, just the people on the back seem to quite like it. Anyway, the show was all about me and my book, and I wasn't sure quite how it would do. It did really well. On YouTube, probably the best for months in terms of an audience, and I could tell because I can see the data. It's like the Matrix, it all reveals itself to me. A lot of people were not subscribers. They were people who just come to the show. I guess it's recommended, or it comes on your feed, or if you like and have watched World War II stuff, it might pop up as a suggestion. Anyway, quite a few people did come. And if you're one of them, welcome. Please stay around. Please like, please subscribe. And let me know in the comments if you are new. I'd be lovely to find out how you heard about it and what you think. So thank you. Yeah, lots of lovely comments. Again, many of them for people I hadn't really seen on here before. Some very, very odd usernames. Sorry if it's you. MSNYX823, Muznix823. From the perspective of an Australian doing post-grad history research, it's definitely time for the British to re-examine their empire and its complexities. Well, thank you. That's what I'm trying to do. And then you went on to make some really interesting points about how many Australians actually felt the British sort of let them down in the Second World War, which I know is a big issue there. Well, certainly was at the time, and historians sort of argue about it. But yeah, thanks for the engagement. Fiona Dees, 7175, another fascinating podcast. Oh, well, you can't be new, Fiona. Thank you, says Fiona, and thank you to you, Fiona. Alison Kent. Alison, you've been on here a lot. One of our longest and most generous supporters. Thank you once more. A sober look at colonialism, you say, is needed. Yes, I agree. The SBS, that's an Australian channel, the SBS series on the Australian wars, which is really the wars of colonisation, really opened my eyes to how comfortable it all was, gave me a whole new perspective. And that one on World War II is absolutely needed. I can't wait to read your book. Oh, thank you, Alison. Thank you very much. Yeah, I actually knew for the people who worked on that SBS show. It's really, really good. Interesting. Comet 2006. I've enjoyed this video for here in the States. Thank you, Comet. And I'll be buying your book. Oh, well, that's exactly what I want to read. By the way, I'm a fan of your other books, Finest Hour and End of the Beginning. Isn't that nice? Well, this is the end of the trilogy. So thank you, Comet, and welcome. If you're new, please stick around. Nick Greetham. Now, Nick, you've been around a lot. I thought you were, sorry, made me laugh. Again. Yeah, interesting show, Phil. I've never heard of this week's featured author, but it seems like an engaging fellow. Very funny. Very funny. Yes, it'll become so solipsistic, I'll end up interviewing myself, won't I? No, I promise I won't. We have some interesting material to come with a completely new guest who is going to talk not about the Second World War. Well, it will a bit, actually, but it's all about Hong Kong. Yeah, it's the story, not so much of a person, but a place. But it's also a place that has a slightly scandalous history, so I thought that would be quite an interesting experiment. Plus, Paul has been on the show before. He's very good, incredibly knowledgeable about all things Chinese. He wrote the book about Wallis Simpson, and that show got a lot of love. So he's back, and I'll be getting to him in a minute. But first, I wanted to rant a little bit. I haven't done a rant for a while, and this week something really, really annoyed me. And I think it's a real scandal. I mean, it's probably the biggest scandal in British social history, social policy forever. I'm talking, of course, about the grooming gangs or the rape gangs, as they're called. This, over many decades, I'm sure you will know, organised groups of men, often men with a certain amount of money, who are targeting girls in over 50 places. There have been cases, and it's always the same pattern. It's almost invariably men of a Pakistani origin of the community, men from a community where it's quite likely they're not expected to kind of date or have sexual relationships until they're married with women of their own community. And they found themselves in cities and towns where there is a supply of young girls, almost always white, and almost always from the sort of type of teenager who is on the margin of society. Perhaps they're in a children's home, or they're from a broken home, or they've been abused, or they have trouble with, they're absconding from school, they're getting into drink and alcohol at too young an age, they're hanging around. And these men come and they've got cars and they buy them drinks and they make them feel special and they say they're their boyfriends. And sometimes they pay them, or at least that was alleged. But often it was just these girls believed that they were kind of having a relationship. And then almost invariably, the pattern is once you've seen one of the men, it'll meet my friends, and then there's a party, and then there's more drink and drugs. And pretty soon you can't get out of it. And it gets horrible and it gets really violent. And there's threats, and people have died, people were injured. And the particularly bad part about this story, upsetting part, there's a brilliant BBC drama called Three Girls about this, which if you haven't seen, you should. Although I have to say it hasn't been covered as much as it should be on a national broadcaster, but that was a brilliant programme. And there have been various documentaries. But one of the worst parts of all of this was that the local authorities stood by, knowing it was happening, and very often did nothing for a long, long time. I'm talking about the police, council officials, social workers, people in the foster sector, even judges. There was a kind of paralysing fear of being accused of racism. And this has it's all come out. There's been lots, the cases of many people have gone to prison. There have been lots of in-depth investigations. People have admitted that they didn't act. And some of them are really quite grim. I mean, you can easily find testimony, and the actual details of the abuse are quite just disturbing and horrible. But many of these girls did try and get help, and they made allegations to social workers, to the police. But sometimes the police returned the girls to the men who were abusing them. A social worker went to the wedding, well, it was a religious wedding of one of these girls who was 14. The social worker went to the wedding, thought it would be good for her to have some stability in her life. She's 14. And some abusers worked for the local authorities. The ringleader of one of the worst gangs in the town of Rochdale was employed as a welfare rights officer by the council in Oldham. And not one person in the whole country has been convicted of covering up or assisting this organised, institutionalised rape and abuse. And it's just a stain. And it's just a terrible, terrible story. Anyway, the government, the one I voted for, had promised a limited number of inquiries. Inquiries that are meant to look into the bigger picture, not the men themselves. A lot of them have been found guilty and gone to prison, but why it was allowed to happen for so long. And there's obviously a huge sensitivity about this because almost in every case, these towns were run by the Labour Party. And a lot of the people who found themselves involved in the case were Labour members, sometimes active members of the party. And we know because newspapers covered this at the time, the first people to try and blow the whistle, and they were usually Labour Party members, councillors, or even MPs, they got horribly abused. Oh, you're racist. This is terrible. Why are you pointing the finger? Don't you realise that white people abuse children all the time? Very true. Not in this way, though. In this there was this sort of paradigm, this model that emerged. And people lost friends and lost status for trying to raise this. So yeah, there's a lot of sensitivity in the Labour Party, but still they did agree to these inquiries under a lot of pressure. Pressure really ramped up when Elon Musk got involved, and that's a whole new different thing. I mean, I'm sure he was just trying to cause trouble, but the pressure ramped up. They agreed to some inquiries, and then about 2 days ago, the last hour of the sitting of Parliament before it breaks for Easter, 2-week break, most Labour MPs didn't know. There was hardly anybody in the House of Commons. The minister in charge of women's rights and welfare got up and said, we're not doing this anymore. We're going to have a few smaller scale things with local councils. The councils themselves will be given some money to do more investigation. But it's the councils who need to be investigated. This is the problem. What we need is a judge-led national inquiry into this unprecedented and massive scandal. A judge-led inquiry that can compel people to give evidence under oath. Because we haven't even scratched the surface of why this appalling thing happened. And you just have to conclude they don't want to. I mean, some of the stories, I mentioned a couple, but there's a famous one about the man who tried to rescue his daughter from when she was basically locked in a flat with the men who were abusing her, he was arrested. And the abuse continued. He was arrested for causing trouble, breaching the peace, whatever. The priorities were community relations. Oh, you want to disturb community relations? Well, I'm sorry, there are many, many leading British Muslims, especially young and female British Muslims, who are just as furious about this as I am, as everybody should be. And yet, for some reason, it got into their minds that this will just stir up trouble. And of course, a lot of these MPs and ministers live in seats where they depend, their majorities quite likely depend on the Muslim vote, and that's influenced heavily by what's been said in the mosque. And we saw at the last election some pretty, I thought, grim pictures of leading Labour MPs kind of sitting around by the elders of whatever community, Angela Rayner, our Deputy Prime Minister, a room entirely full of bearded men making her pitch. And it got very nasty at the last election because of the anger about what was happening in Gaza. There were some very ugly scenes at the counts and during the campaign. Jess Phillips, she's the minister who has done the big pullback, a woman who was known previously for her very high-profile campaigns to support women and girls under the threat of violence. That was her big issue. She almost lost her seat. At the count, you can look it up on YouTube, it's really horrible. The screaming, the abuse, she had to have police protection. It's intimidation. Could it be that, I mean, I think it is, that senior members of the government of my country are so afraid of that level of intimidation, and they feel that to keep community relations on an even keel, they can't do this much needed inquiry. I think that is what's happening, and it shouldn't happen. Trevor Phillips happens to be black, shouldn't matter, but probably does, leading a campaigner against racism throughout my lifetime. And the chair of the Britain's Equality and Human Rights Commission said this: "I cannot tell you how furious I am about this." That's what he said. It is shameful what the government are doing. Shameful. And I'm sure Trevor Phillips has been a Labour voter all his life. Why can't the left speak about some things? He said. And it's true, the left was created, the Labour Party especially, was created and grew to help families just like the ones who have suffered abuse. But it seems, whether it's just fear of street politics, sectarian politics, or just this obsession and paralysis, that the fear of being called racist, this obsession with identity politics, I don't know what it is, but it seems to have lost its moral courage. It's me speaking, but it's Trevor Phillips speaking. And something else he said, which I think is really true, there are lots of young, reform-minded Muslims in this country and around the world. And they campaign, especially for things like women of Iran. And the Labour Party has a proud history of secularism, anti-clericalism, free speech, and especially feminism. Why aren't we aligning ourselves with those Muslims, not the old men at the mosque? And I'm sure some of the old men at the mosque are lovely and fine, but we have seen some disturbing things. And it's usually the old men at the mosque who are pushing them. I'm talking about things that happened, for example, in my old school, Batley Grammar School. I've spoken about this before, where a teacher had to go into hiding because of a row about showing portraits of Muhammad. So yeah, it just feels like this fear of fearing racist is enabling a kind of injustice. It's deepening division. It looks like you're protecting a local political machine rather than looking for justice. There's one or two Labour MPs who've spoken out, and apparently behind the scenes others are furious. The local authorities do not have the capability, the authority, or the motivation to investigate themselves. We do need that national inquiry. I'm sure it'll happen, if not under this government, under the next. And this is a sort of story that will be very important at the next election, I think. The decades-long abuse of young British women and a thorough cover-up of it for many, many years. This needs to be kind of completely driven out of our history and our politics. Labour said, Starmer said he wanted to reform the state and bring honesty and integrity and trust to government. And yet he did something that was so sleazy and cowardly, and it just kind of breaks the bonds that should hold society together. Yeah, I feel that strongly about it, as you can probably see. So anyway, that's my, I've done a rant for a while, but just, I sort of, maybe because I voted Labour and I have been a Labour man most of my life, when you actually see the cynicism that's going on with this particular decision, it shakes you. So I don't know. I don't know where I am now. How I'd vote, to be honest. Anyway, there you go. Phil's feelings on the left, and well, you've had Phil's feelings on the empire, and in a minute you'll have Phil's feelings about Hong Kong, or rather Paul's, because it's time for me to shut up. I'll see you at the end of the interview with Paul. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you stay to the end. Okay, thank you. Bye. Paul, welcome back to an experiment. We're not going to talk about a person for once on this interview for the podcast. We're going to talk about a place.
We are.
And what a place. A place you know well.
An amazing place.
But a place with something of an interesting history, which can maybe be scandalous from time to time.
Well, I think, the aspect we're going to talk about, which is, your sort of favorite subject, the end of the Second World War and the fallout from that, and how decisions were made that affected many different countries, and of course then affected Britain itself. Talking about Hong Kong, and probably the Hong Kong that people know now, or have known in the last 50 years or so, very different place to before the Second World War and after the Second World War, and a contrast as well, I think, to having had a sneak preview of your excellent book, 1975, The Reckoning. I'll give it a plug because it really is very readable. But your Hong Kong is distinctly different to most of the places that you're talking about at that time.
Well, let's go back even further in time, because I think most people won't know. I'm right in thinking that the British kind of grabbed Hong Kong as a consequence of the Opium Wars. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, basically what happened was, obviously we were very keen on the China trade. We were making a lot of money. We were making a lot of money on tea, silks, and of course the O word, opium, which I know you've done a program about, so I won't go over the whole opium industry. But we were reliant on being settled in Macau for half of the year. The Chinese would only let the foreigners trade in Canton, now Guangzhou, for 6 months of the year. And for most of the rest of the year, which was also typhoon season and so on, we were stuck in Macau, which was, of course, a Portuguese colony. And the East India country and the free country traders, if you like, the people will know those kind of names like Jardine, Matheson, and those kind of people who are still big companies. They wanted their own typhoon-free port that the British could control, not at the behest of the Portuguese. And so after the first Opium War, which I won't go into all of that because you've done that program before, people can go back and listen to that very excellent show. The demands that Britain made on the weak Qing dynasty that was running China at that time were several. The first was Hong Kong Island in perpetuity. This is very important to remember when we get to the later stuff. In perpetuity, the British would control Hong Kong Island. Good typhoon-free ports, close to the Canton Delta, gets them away from reliance on Macau. And secondly, a number of what were called treaty ports. And again, this is a very interesting idea when compared to reading your book, which mostly focuses on sort of India, and a very different approach by British colonialism here with treaty ports. So these are places that ultimately become international settlements ruled on the China coast, ruled by extraterritoriality. So when you are in those treaty ports, you are not subject to Chinese law. You are subject to the law of your own country. And various other countries on the coattails of the British sign treaty port deals. I mean, everyone from the United States, of course, France, Portugal, Germany, Italy, many other countries. And the two best known of those that people will know that were treaty ports are, of course, Shanghai and Tianjin, which is effectively the port for Shanghai, of course, being the head of the Yangtze. So everything that comes up and down the Yangtze goes through Shanghai. And Tianjin, which is effectively the port for Beijing. It's 70 miles. Beijing is 70 miles inland from Tianjin. So those two, but there were many others as well.
Were the Chinese relaxed about any of this stuff? I mean, I know that they were forced to hand over Hong Kong, but I know this is a different thing to a treaty port. But if they're letting the French and the Germans and the Americans do it as well as us, was that because they saw there was something in it for China, or they were just too weak to resist?
No, they were just too weak to resist. And this is why, of course, nowadays, the Communist Party of China would refer to these as unequal treaties. And they'd be quite correct in that. They were unequal treaties. They were forced at gunboat on the Chinese. They had no choice. And so this is why, it starts what the Chinese Communist Party describes as the century of humiliation for China. And so the return of Hong Kong, the return of Macau, they would probably bundle in the return of Taiwan, but I'm not going to get into that one, would all be part of, resolving the century of humiliation as China becomes a strong nation again.
Right, right. All right. So in the sort of 20s and 30s, we're fast forwarding a lot. Hong Kong becomes very glamorous. And we touched on it when we talked about Wallace, but the whole area becomes kind of glamorous and a bit dangerous and a bit exciting, and it's sort of cool as well. And I guess that reputation with Hong Kong lasts well into the post-war world as well. Was it deserved, or was it just a regular port city?
No, I mean the thing about it is that if you were a young man who was looking to go out east and build your career with one of the what were called the Hongs, which are sort of Jardine Mathesons, who of course still are Jardines today, Swires, who are of course still around in Hong Kong. They own Cathay Pacific hotels, or Cathay Pacific Airlines, sorry, or one of those. If you were looking to do that, or a consular career with the Foreign Service, when your time was chosen, you really, really hoped you didn't get Hong Kong,
Ah,
because Hong Kong was a bit of a backwater. It was Royal Navy port with all the fun and games that go on with being a Royal Navy port. It was pestilential, you know.
mhm, mhm.
The weather was humid and hot and terrible.
So
Um,
you
so,
could
so
get
you
beaten
didn't
up,
want
get
Hong Kong.
beaten up by a drunken sailor and then die of malaria.
Absolutely. Whereas if you could get Shanghai, right? That was the city to get. And
Right.
Tianjin a little bit behind it. But Shanghai became the place to go. So in the 20s and 30s, all the reputation of looseness and fun and making a lot of money is attached to Shanghai. Hong Kong is a kind of navy port. It isn't really important at that point. It isn't a listening post on China. It's not a great cargo port at that point. It isn't manufacturing anything. The south of China is pretty sleepy at that point. So don't think of Hong Kong then as you would think of Hong Kong now. That is all post-war, that kind of
Right, right.
role of Hong Kong as a massive financial center. Of course, there are important companies there, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, HSBC, Standard Charters, as I said, Jardine, Swires, big companies like that. But it's not making any money compared to Shanghai. Shanghai is the place where everyone wants to be and where everything is happening. Um, but of course, in 1937, as the Japanese attacked China, so Shanghai, falls in under problems with the Japanese and never really recovers after the war. Whereas Hong Kong, of course, becomes this massive financial cargo entrepot economy that kind of then booms even more as southern China booms in the 80s and the 90s, and today it becomes a manufacturing export town. It becomes full of refugees from Shanghai, from Guangdong province, and this is the vibrancy that it gets. But that's only really after the war.
So let's go to the war because, as you say, I don't really mention Hong Kong much in my book. I'm looking at other places. How is it that we managed to get our hands back on this place after the Japanese have been driven out or agree to leave? I'm not quite sure what happened actually. Is there a negotiation or are they just driven out?
Well, I mean, I think the one thing that sort of struck me when I read your book, particularly because you're talking about Bose and the Indian National Army, and you're talking about the Burmese that were sympathetic to the Japanese and saw that as an anti-imperialist cause. This never really happens in Hong Kong, and it never really happens in China, because by the fall of Hong Kong, which is December 1941, after the big push down after Pearl Harbor, and it's a vicious and deadly battle before Hong Kong falls on Christmas Day 1941. Remember that the Chinese have had a long time to learn just how brutal and
Mm,
vicious Japanese occupation can be, which of
mm.
course was not the case for the Indians, or even the Burmese to an extent, or perhaps those that might have been a bit more sympathetic in the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia,
Mm, mm.
or Malaya as well, although that they would learn. But you have to remember that the Chinese really, I mean, it goes back to the First World War, right? I mean, during the First World War, the Japanese swoop in and take Qingdao, the city of Qingdao, from the Germans, because the Japanese are technically allies, but they extend that to take the whole of Shandong province, which is one of the great cultural and philosophical hearts of China because it's where Confucius came from. So this is a real dagger to the heart of the Chinese people, as it was described at the time. And that's why the Chinese didn't sign the post-war treaty after the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, because of the issue of Shandong. Then in 1931, 1932, the Japanese come back and they take Manchuria, right? Which is a massive swathe of land. Effectively, they control everything from Dalian port on the coast all the way across to the Russian Far East border, with big cities like Harbin and so on in that. And they rename it Manchukuo. And they put the old deposed emperor Puyi, the boy emperor, the last emperor, they put him on the throne as a puppet emperor. That's 1932. And then, of course, in 1937, sorry about the dates, but it is
No, it's all fascinating. We're gonna get to Nanking, I'm sure, fairly soon.
Absolutely. So in 1937, the Japanese roll down from Manchuria, and in July they take Beijing, which is not the capital at this time. Nanjing is the capital at this time, but they take the historic ancient city of Beijing. They take the treaty port of Tianjin in case foreigners wanted to know whether or not they were going to have trouble with the Japanese. And then they keep rolling down. So by August and the summer, we see them attacking Shanghai and Suzhou and around the Yangtze Delta, but they don't take the international settlement because to do that would have meant war with Britain, France, America, and so on. So they leave the international settlement alone and the French concession in Shanghai, but they take everything else and then they roll up the Yangtze, which is where all the goods and trade and treasure of the hinterlands of China flow out from. And of course, as you mentioned in your book, in September 1937, we get the horrific, brutal massacres by the Japanese army in Nanjing, which is also the capital of China. And Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government go to the top of the Yangtze, just above where the Japanese army are, to the city of Chongqing at the top of the Yangtze. And that becomes China's wartime capital. So by 1941, and then of course the Japanese then roll all the way down into the southern China and Guangdong province bordering Hong Kong. And many of the majority of Chinese in Hong Kong, of course, have ancestry from Guangdong province. So, and the fighting around Guangzhou and what would now be Shenzhen and all of that area on the border with Hong Kong is vicious and brutal. So after all of that, after Manchuria, after the taking of the ancient capital of Peking, of the attacks on Shanghai, and particularly the rape of Nanking, as it's known, no Chinese in Hong Kong were unaware of what Japanese rule would mean, right? So although there was a small group of collaborators, who really attracted very little support during the war and had to be propped up by the Chinese government and were forever getting assassinated.
I mean, just to slightly go back to my book, Mr. Bose turns up in Nanjing with those collaborators as their guest and makes this extraordinary speech about pan-Asian values and how the future is Asians caring for other Asians in Nanjing, where all this unbelievable atrocity had taken place. And it wasn't just like the conquest of a city and a couple of days of horror. It was 6 weeks, wasn't it, of just sustained sadism.
Of course, Bose had been in Germany before, as you described, and seems to have been chose to be blind to the atrocities that were, the roundups of Jews and socialists and trade unionists and so on. There, how he could not possibly have not known what had happened in Nanjing, and he chooses not to. And the other ones that are there's the collaborationist from Burma is there. There are some others there. Dutch East Indies, but mostly a man called Wang Jingwei, who was politically angry because he had been on the left of the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, and he had lost out for the leadership after the death of Sun Yat-sen to Chiang Kai-shek, and that had put him into a sort of political wilderness, and he ends up becoming this, China's Petan, China's Vichy, right? And Nanking is the capital, but he runs it mostly with the help of a real sort of group of thugs out of Shanghai. And it's all about personal enrichment. It's not really about, it's a real thug regime. And it becomes China's Vichy. And he has gone down in history in China as probably the worst insult you can have, which is, he is Hanjin. He is a traitor. in China, and that there's no movement on that. You can argue a little bit about Chiang Kai-shek in China, but there's no argument about Wang Jingwei, and he really attracted no support. He wasn't like Bose. He didn't have an army. He didn't have much support. He just had the Japanese governors, sort of inviting him along to dinner every so often, pretending he had some sort of power. And he died on an operating table towards the end of the war. And
well, perhaps rather fortunate in that respect. I suspect he would have died in a rather more unpleasant way had the Chinese got hold of him.
Almost immediately, all of his support, any support that he had, just dribbles away and disappears because there really was nothing there. So you can maybe understand why, whilst the Chinese in Hong Kong might not be particularly overly delighted with British rule, they are not. They are quite aware of what will happen when Japan takes over and how brutal and nasty it could get.
So let's jump to the end of the war. How did we manage to kind of leverage our way back in, we being the Brits?
Well, it was all a bit of a scramble, really, Phil. A rather unseemly scandal. I mean, it's worth saying that, of course, most of the leadership of the colony, the colonial leadership of the colony, had been interned during the war. In Stanley Camp, which is the famous camp. Mark Young, who'd been the governor, who surrendered to the Japanese, was very ill, so wasn't able to resume being the governor. But within Stanley Camp, there had been a lot of planning going on for what would happen at the end of the war, and there was via kind of via Chinese agents that managed to keep operating in Hong Kong, and others, including the British Army Aid Group, that managed to operate out of Macau, which of course was neutral because it was a Portuguese colony. So it was a very useful sort of spot it was a nest of spies, as they say, during the war, kind of Casablanca of the East, a really fascinating subject in its own right. But other people had views on what should happen in Hong Kong. Most particularly, FDR in America was very against colonialism and felt that it should become a free port, an international free port, which would suit America's interests. But I'm going to have to take your listeners back to something that you really should have learnt about at school and everyone should know about, but of course no one has ever heard of, which is the 1943 Sino-British Treaty for the Relinquishment of Extraterritorial Rights in China that was signed in January 1943. Now, nobody much knows about this treaty, but to the Chinese, it's really important because what happens, this treaty is negotiated in Chongqing between the British, who are, of course, allies with the Chinese and Chiang Kai-shek, and they agree to relinquish their treaty powers from back in the days of the Opium Wars in Shanghai and Tianjin and elsewhere, and that will happen immediately. So that when the war ends, we will not go back to the old treaty ports of Shanghai and Tianjin. So that's why Shanghai just disappears, and becomes an all-Chinese city in 1945.
And Churchill's quite relaxed about this, is he? Because he doesn't normally like giving away bits of territory.
Churchill, during these debates, Chiang Kai-shek turns around and says, okay, that's great. Lovely to have Shanghai back. Lovely to have Tianjin back and a few other places. So Hong Kong, at which point Horace James, who's the British ambassador, says, so I have to ask London about that one. and of course he asks London, and Churchill explodes. Because the fascinating thing is that Shanghai and Tianjin are sending buckets of money back to London all the time, right? All the money that's being made. And in the First World War, all the people that were out there making money returned to England because they wanted to fight in the trenches and everything. And they realized in the Second World War that was a disaster. So they told all the men in Shanghai in the Second World War, stay where you are, make money and send as much money back to us as you can and keep supplying commodities, right? In China was a supplier of wolfram, for instance, which, is always considered very important in kind of the Second World War. It's a supplier of everything, So they need them there. So they don't go, which means, of course, they all get interned during the Second World War once the Japanese take over the whole of Shanghai. But they don't leave. So they're returning all this money. But Churchill never really evinces much interest in Shanghai or Tianjin or the other treaty ports because they are, well, some people call them semi-colonial, but that they're not British colonies like Hong Kong or like Singapore or obviously like India, right? And including Burma in the Raj at that point. And so he doesn't really kind of get Shanghai. He doesn't really get the treaty port concept. And in fact, he may have been slightly sympathetic. I mean, I don't know if you know this. This is a fascinating one for your listeners, perhaps. But there was always a debate rumbling along, which was we got it the wrong way round, right? We should have created treaty ports in India and taken over the whole of China, right? But we screwed it up. So there was nothing really much in the interior of India that we wanted, but we did want Bombay, Calcutta, and other ports, right? The interior of China has many, many things that we wanted. It grows opium, it grows tea. I mean, eggs. We used to ship eggs from China to Britain to sort of make up for our eggs.
Did we really? Good Lord, I had no idea.
Pig bristles. Of course, the Chinese national meat is pork, but the pig bristles were what they used to make toothbrushes from. So they would ship barrels and barrels of pig bristles. People made fortunes on nuts, all sorts of things from China. And you want the ports. You want Shanghai, Tianjin, Fuzhou, Guangzhou, all of those ports, right? So, I mean, and then this goes back to Clive of India. Clive of India petitioned the India office to say, now that I've, won the Carnatic Wars, let me go to China and conquer the whole of China. And they say, no, we don't want to do that. But all through the 19th and into the 20th century, there was an argument that says that we screwed that one up. We should have taken over the whole of China and had treaty ports in India. Now, whether or not that would have been possible is a sort of an interesting question, but it's one of those sort of what ifs of history, right? What if we'd done it the other way around?
Gosh.
So anyway, to get back to my point, Churchill wasn't really ever interested in treaty ports. What he was interested in was colonies, and he saw Hong Kong as a linchpin of the British Empire in the Far East, along with Singapore. And we know that when he lost Hong Kong, and then particularly when they lost Singapore, he was quite devastated by those losses. That was seen as really.
Well, I mean, he was always a navy man, and of course, the big ports is the Royal Navy east of Suez. It's the presence that secured and underwrote the whole of the empire.
Yeah, he has a link as well because his great uncle or his great great uncle, actually, I was there the other week, died when he was aboard ship just off of Macau, and is buried in the Protestant cemetery in Macau. So he has a family member buried out that way. This is of course the history of empires. Everyone has relations that went there. Dickens's son went out there as a tea taster. Jane Austen's brothers went there, as sailors. So everyone has links out to southern China. So he goes absolutely ballistic and says, "No way! If Chiang Kai-shek forces it on Hong Kong, I'm abandoning the entire treaty." So Chiang Kai-shek had to back off on Hong Kong, but Chiang Kai-shek found that he had a bit of a friend in FDR, and also he found that he had a bit of a friend later in Stalin. So when it was discovered that FDR, when hit again later during the Yalta, I think it was, conference, when Churchill found that FDR and Stalin had been discussing the issue of Hong Kong to be a free port after the war, he goes ballistic again and throws his toys out of his pram and says, "I'm not talking about anything else. Hong Kong we cannot do anything about Hong Kong."
Well, he does that quite a lot at Yalta. There's a passage I quote where the note keepers can't keep up because he's shouting. Yeah. And he's just so kind of angry about these suggestions that the bits of British colonies should be carved up.
Yeah, no, he doesn't like it. He doesn't like being told what to do, and he feels deeply about the colonies. I mean, not for their welfare particularly. Just he feels the British Empire, but Shanghai and places were never bits of pink on the map, right? Because they weren't completely British, so he doesn't really feel about those. So to go back to the Sino-British Treaty for the relinquishment of extraterritorial rights,
which we certainly should, and more people need to know about.
I hope all of your listeners are now very familiar with. It meant that come 1945 and the liberation of Shanghai and Tianjin, which happens in August, the same time as Hong Kong, the Chinese just walk back into Shanghai and take it over, the nationalist government. So the argument then is, if we lose Hong Kong, we will have no foothold in China after 1945. It would be the end of our empire in China. We would have nothing. Fortunately for Churchill, FDR dies and Harry Truman comes in, and Truman couldn't care less about Hong Kong and couldn't point to it on a map and just doesn't have an opinion on the
Yeah.
subject.
And of course, America is changing quite rapidly itself, isn't it? America is now grabbing, having been at the force, at least in theory, for decolonization. America is becoming a kind of empire itself, which is so interesting, I think, in the late 40s.
And America has another problem in China, which also works to Churchill's advantage, which is as soon as the war against Japan ends, Chiang Kai-shek goes straight into a war again with the communists. So we go straight from the Second World War into the Chinese Civil War. And America is very heavily invested in Chiang Kai-shek. FDR had invested America very heavily in supplying Chiang Kai-shek and ignoring the corruption in the Chiang family and just how bad things had got, which the Chinese people were not ignoring, hence their move over towards the Communist Party in large part. Truman, again, decides to continue this, but doesn't think so much of Chiang Kai-shek. In fact, he's the famous cash my check was what they sort of called him. And so he sort of pulls America back on that one and pulls America out of that mess. This means that Chiang Kai-shek is, fighting this battle to the death with the communists. And he starts to lose it quite quickly. And so, of course, over the period of 1946 into 47 into 48, we start to see the nationalists losing ground to the communists taking city after city, and eventually Chiang Kai-shek loading as much of the gold as possible, loading as much as the treasure out of the Forbidden City as possible, and getting himself and his men and his loyalists over to Formosa, Taiwan, right? And that is the start of Taiwan as the Republic of China, which, of course, it is called to this day. And of course, in 1949, we get the People's Republic of China. So what that meant was that Chiang Kai-shek didn't have time to worry about Hong Kong. So this idea that as soon as the war was over, Chinese nationalist troops may flood across the border and take the city, which would have been possible as we had no soldiers there, and those that were there had been in camps for 4 years and were in terrible conditions, starvation and so on. That threat went away. The Royal Navy then go full steam ahead to get into Hong Kong Harbour, Victoria Harbour, before the Americans. And they managed to do it. At the same time, the doors of Stanley Camp are thrown open. And a man called Franklin Gibson, who had been the first colonial secretary, has received orders from London to re-establish things as quickly as possible, to the point that they have managed to smuggle a Union Jack into Stanley Camp. He and the other men who formed the initial government of him, they're in terrible condition. I mean, it's like they're completely malnourished. They've been in a terrible state living in Stanley Camp, but they rush down to the center of Hong Kong and they run the Union Jack up the flag and they declare the colony British again. At which point Truman's not very interested. Chiang Kai-shek's off fighting somewhere. Royal Navy arrive in Victoria Harbour. And we're kind of back on. And to go back to my point about how disastrous was it for, how the Chinese always knew that Japanese occupation would be disastrous, there is then a very quick, commonly held consensus among the the Western China trading organizations, the big companies, the British government, the Navy, and the Chinese elites, the Chinese business elites, what at the time they used to call the gentry often, that we need to get these show back on the road and we need to do well, because the Chinese now are not fearing that, they're fearing the communists.
Right.
So the idea of obviously in the Dutch East Indies, you have the whole kind of, creation of Indonesia, right? And Sukarno and so on. Similar moves and issues take place in Burma and Malaya, and with Chinese in Singapore, although part of Malaya at that time, and elsewhere around the region. But in Hong Kong, just as before, they knew exactly what was going to happen when the Japanese arrived. They now know exactly what will happen to them if the communists arrive, right? So there is a common cause to get Hong Kong back on track. And Gibson
But how is a small detachment, even if it's got a few Royal Naval ships in the harbour, how is that going to stand against Mao Zedong's army in a couple of years once they've kind of taken firm charge of China? I mean, it would have been a rather unequal war, wouldn't it?
It would have been, but they get a few years to kind of re-establish the colony. And they managed to get the monetary system back in place. They managed to get the trading system back in place. There is a lot of money flowing into the colony. One question that you can talk about is how much trade still went on in Hong Kong during the war and whether or not that was a collaborationist trade or not. And that's still something that no one really wants to talk too much about.
Mhm.
You've got a lot of money being made over in Macau. So you've got people that your listeners may know about, like Stanley Ho, who became the casino king of Macau and only died a few years ago at 100 and something. He made enormous amounts of money during the war, moving goods around. And he came back and invested that money in Hong Kong, a company called Shuntak, which lists on the stock exchange, which gets going again. So and there's also a new governor is sent, what was his name? Hang on. Sorry, Mark. No, what's his name? I can't remember his name, but
Doesn't matter. I forget my own characters all the time.
Sorry, a new governor comes, and he's been interned up in the north of China during the war, and he does make some concessions, some reasonably important concessions. He kind of allows more Chinese in the police. There's a ridiculous rule that say that Chinese can't live on the peak. The peak is the sort of, if you've been to Hong Kong, you'll know it sits above the harbour and only Westerners could live there. He changes that rule. There's a little bit of changing of the rules in Legco, but no democracy. But a few more changes of things that sort of placate some of the local Chinese gentry, as they were called. And so really from the Japanese surrender to the Royal Navy coming into the harbour and securing it, it's only 2 weeks. But Frank Gimpson and his team do all of these things. They've been preparing in Stanley. They've been designing new post-war stamps. They've got this Union Jack.
These men who are half starved to death.
Yeah, and they've been drawing up new rules and regulations
I never knew that.
on things. And they've kind of been in touch with some of the through secret, through people that could come and go. They've been in touch with some of the Chinese business leaders.
So I guess by the time, Mao was in charge, the Civil War's over, which we're now several years in the future. It's probably he's thinking, well, do I really want to go to war with Britain now? And also maybe there was, and I think this is what happens, isn't it? Hong Kong becomes such an important place for trade, allowing communist China to get stuff out and money in. Is that a fair assumption of how it works?
Yeah. Mao inherits a country that's been at war for 12 years against the Japanese and then in a civil war. Mao inherits a country that has his deadliest enemy, Chiang Kai-shek, with American support, sitting on Taiwan. And at that time, it's not entirely clear that Chiang Kai-shek won't re-invade with American help to try and take the country back. He's got a lot of other things to do. He's got relationships with the Soviet Union, of course, that are new, what they called the big brother and little brother relationship between that, which falls apart in another 10 years, but for a while is a good relationship. It ends in the Sino-Soviet split, but for a while it works. He's got an awful lot to do. He moves the capital back up to Beijing. He wants to build an industrial city. He wants, all of these things that he said. He wants to catch up Britain in steel production. I mean, that sort of sounds silly now that China should want to catch up Britain in steel production. I mean, it's ridiculous. But, that's where he kind of wants to be. And you're quite right. He does want pragmatically to have somewhere where there can be some sort of outlet for goods to come in and out with that he can sort of control. And having the British there is quite helpful. So they stay there for a while. He's probably quite weak. He doesn't necessarily want to go to war with them. It would get everyone on against him. He doesn't want that. At the same time, Hong Kong is actually becoming a lot stronger because all of the people that are flooding out of China, because they don't want to make an accommodation with the communists, many of those are going to Hong Kong and they're establishing themselves there. So everything from, if you think about the first post-97 chief executive, that was a man called Tung Chi-hua. Well, the Tung family were a Shanghai shipping family that came down to Hong Kong, really were involved in building up the shipping industry. And this is when we see Shanghai become Hong Kong, become the world's biggest port and grow to a size of a port. grow the port with containerism and all the rest of it. It becomes somewhere with a massive airline hub as well, thanks to Cathay Pacific and Kai Tak
Yeah,
Airport.
and I may have been wrong about the 20s and 30s about it being cool, but I'm not wrong about the 50s and 60s. It
No,
becomes very cool. And everybody remembers the James Bond and the bottoms up bar and all that kind of stuff.
yeah, then it becomes somewhere where the American Navy pulls in regularly. It becomes somewhere where a lot of money is flowing through. Uh, the entrepreneurial class of Guangdong province, which is of course like Hong Kong, all Cantonese speaking, come across to Hong Kong, and they build up massive empires. I mean, one thinks of Li Ka-shing, who's now in a little bit of trouble with Beijing because of the Panama Canal. But he ends up buying the ports at the end of the Panama Canal. I mean, starts off sort of making plastic flowers in a little factory. So these sort of empires are built. The Shanghai shipping firms come down, the textile producers come down from Shanghai. You think of the boom of the Hong Kong film industry, which didn't really exist before the war. That's the people like the Shaw brothers, who were the big film studios in Shanghai. Of course, under Mao, they can't make the sort of films they were making, so they moved down to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong becomes this kind of hub place that sort of links up, well, Macau, obviously, but Singapore, the new sort of boom towns of Kuala Lumpur, across to Bangkok, across to Jakarta. And so by the 70s and 80s, this is a booming place. And it becomes very important during the Vietnam War as well, as somewhere where Americans go for R&R, but also, where they're sending in supplies from. And
So why was it then that this 97 thing had to happen? See, the way we've just been discussing it, it seemed like it suited everybody. The Chinese had this gateway to the West had a gateway to the East, everybody was making money. What's the problem?
Yes
Pride?
and no.
Is it pride?
I mean, look, to go back to the Opium Wars of 1842, the deal was Hong Kong Island in perpetuity. There was then a later deal done
Kowloon.
Kowloon and the new territories, which is the bit that people will know when you stand in Hong Kong and look across at Kowloon, and then it runs all the way up to the border. You may have gone across that border.
I have, yeah.
China. And that is where food, fresh water, power plants, and everything else.
And that's the 99-year lease.
That's the 99-year lease, which ends in 1997.
Got it.
There was a long discussion, and there's so much in the British archives about this, which is fascinating, with various governments up to and including Thatcher, who, of course, was the one that negotiated the final deal, saying, okay, there's nothing we can do about Kowloon and the new territories, but we can hold Hong Kong Island. And people point out that it doesn't have much of a fresh water source. It hasn't got an airport. What are we supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
So, and China's not going to do that deal. It's the whole thing or nothing. Right? The Chinese end of the deal is, this is a reasonably rich place, but it's not so much we want it for the money. It is the Communist Party's message is that we have taken control of this country after a century of unequal treaties and humiliation by the foreign powers. And we are the legitimate leaders of China because we will return these things to you. So, for instance, the Portuguese tried to give Macau back in the 70s because, Portugal was broke at the time and it didn't want the cost of... Macau never made money for Portugal in the way that Hong Kong made money for London. And the Chinese said, no, we have to do Hong Kong first. So that deal's done. Hong Kong, of course, reverts famously in 97. And then Macau reverts in 1999. And then, of course, if you go to the Museum of the History of the Communist Party in Shanghai, it starts with everybody, like a montage of everybody waving Chinese flags at the Hong Kong handover and the Macau handover. And it ends speculatively with everyone waving Chinese flags at the eventual reunification of Taiwan with the motherland. Right?
Yeah.
So there's always this idea that, the job is not done until Taiwan comes back, which is my theory has always been that Taiwan's probably quite safe. I don't want to be the person who gets this absolutely catastrophically wrong because, Xi Jinping could make a different decision. But that for so long, they've said that, the sort of end of this program of communist legitimacy is the return of Taiwan, that if they were to take Taiwan back, people would then say, thank you very much, job done, what's next, right? So, it kind of suits them to have Taiwan there as kind of unfinished business. And also it would be a very bloody takeover as opposed to Hong Kong or Macau, which were kind of negotiated. And of course have ended up quite messy But
Well, we all know in Hong Kong, of course, there was quite a lot of repression in recent years, and full, despite what the treaty might have said and the negotiation might have said, full control now by basically by the Communist
yeah.
Party. Do you go there much? What's it like to work and live in now?
Oh, well, I mean, everyone has a different experience of it. I go there about once a year. I there is a great problem with the democracy movement, and if we're going to look at long-term problems in the world that have largely been created by the British Empire, that has to be one of them, right? I mean, as I said, after the war, the British established their colony in Hong Kong very swiftly, and they may have given little sops to the Chinese community, but there was no move to democracy. And even though he likes to take lots of credit for it, Chris Patton didn't do that either, right? So Hong Kong has always been a slightly odd one in the story of colonization, because in most cases, when we sort of decolonized, we sort of went to the people who were on that land
Mm.
and said to them, "What do you want to do?" Now that didn't always go smoothly. In Malaya, there were issues, of course, and then the split off of Singapore, although ultimately it's worked quite well. But in West Africa, we went to the tribes that lived on those guys, and we tried to sort of work things out. Not always perfectly, far from perfectly. Obviously, in India as well. India for the Indians, right? Malay for the Malays. All of this kind of thing. In Hong Kong, what we did in 1997 was we took a colony and we returned it to a government that we hadn't taken it from initially, if you like, and we didn't really ask the Hong Kong people what they thought about that. We just kind of did that, and that happened to be a country that we were reasonably hostile to. I mean, younger people won't remember this, but 97 came less than a decade after the Tiananmen Square massacre, right? So, there was a lot of fear in 97. I was in Hong Kong for 97, and there was a lot of fear that the tanks would roll over the border and we could see, something as nasty and as horrible as 1989 in Beijing. So it's always been a slightly odd one in that sense, in that, the Hong Kong people are Chinese, but we never kind of consult the Hong Kong people on what they want. We didn't do
There
that
are
in
about 200,000 of them living not far from where I'm sitting. I mean, there's been a big wave of people
Yeah,
escaping
well,
from Hong Kong to southwest London.
250,000
My wife's library is having to stock Chinese books.
And
But
again, a lot of that is comes down to the oddities of empire and so on, because many of those are the British national overseas passport
that's right. And
holders
actually, I expect there'll be model immigrants and we'll probably found loads of companies and create lots of wealth.
from
But
before 97. But my point being that whether it was Chiang Kai-shek wanting the return of it, whether it was us in the Opium Wars, or the Japanese obviously invading, or us in 1945, or anyone in 1997, no one's really ever saying to the Hong Kong people, "What do you want to do?" Right?
no, no.
Because Hong Kong is not a country, right? Hong Kong is a territory, and it is an intrinsic part of China. But Chinese governments have changed. Hong Kong as a colony began during a Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty became the Republic of China. The Republic of China became the People's Republic of China. Under a Maoist system, then under the Deng Xiaoping and an opening up system, which was very beneficial to Hong Kong, and now under a more clamped down political system under Xi Jinping. So, Hong Kong has always been a place that hasn't really had much self-determination.
No. Well, this is really, really cool and interesting. And thank you so much for sharing your amazing knowledge of this place. You've actually made me feel, just in the course of this conversation, probably about 10% more sympathetic to the Chinese view of the world, which I suspect you probably are through the work, the studies that you've made. I mean, I know we see them as being this terrible menace, and we know that they clamp down on freedom of speech, and goodness knows what's happened with the Uyghurs and all this stuff. But they do have a legitimate grievance, I think, don't they, about the century of humiliation or whatever they call it.
It was a century of humiliation. The unequal treaties were unequal, and those treaties that were done after the first Opium War, and then there were more treaties after the second Opium War. Don't forget, the Russians up on the Far East were doing their own unequal treaties about that border up on the Amur River, which is a whole other mess that's still kind of up for debate. but obviously creates places like Vladivostok as northern ports for the Russian
Mm.
Navy. Um, and the taking of land as treaty ports was, although not full colonization in the sense of Hong Kong, it was, very demeaning to the Chinese people to just take Chinese land and run it that way. And there were many, many treaty ports. I mean, I won't run through the list of all of them, but there were loads, really tiny little places through to big places like Shanghai. Um, and we extracted not just us, the Americans, the Portuguese, the Germans, the Italians, many other countries, the Japanese as well, of course, they were a treaty port power. We extracted vast amounts of money from these places. And the conditions in places like, the Shanghai silk filatures and textile factories were beyond Dickensian. They were absolutely awful.
And that's on us. That is on us historically. And that,
And
yeah,
that is on us and other colonial powers,
yeah.
including, of course, in China, Japan's interference in China. And at most points, when something bad happened in China, with the Japanese grabbing Manchuria or something like that, the British, the French, and others used that weakness to try and enlarge the size of the treaty ports or to take new treaty ports or so on. So it was the lease on Hong Kong and the new on Kowloon and the new territories was taken at a point of weakness. It was done either by gunboats or just economic weakness, and it's something that every single Chinese kid at school learns about, and it's something that every single British kid learns absolutely nothing about at
No,
school.
well, that is very
So
true. That is
there's
very
a
true.
massive knowledge gap between us and the Chinese on Anglo-Chinese history.
Do you feel confident about the next 20 years? I mean, or worried, or a mixture of the two?
I'm not overly worried about China. I think China is making, enormous strides in many ways. Its economy is perhaps a little sticky at the moment. I was in Beijing recently, and people are very concerned about youth unemployment or youth not getting the jobs that their qualifications have qualified them for. They're sort of, performing below their qualifications. On the other hand, you go to Beijing and the infrastructure is amazing, the public transport is amazing, the electronic vehicles that they're driving around in are amazing. I mean, out in the countryside, it's obviously a slightly different story. But, as we've seen with China's well thought out and prepared response to Trump's tariffs just this
Mm.
week or just last week, the Chinese are not in a position of weakness anymore. And you've got to understand the Chinese position when you look at something like Trump's tariffs thing. They're looking at that through the eyes of, oh, here we go. This is just another version of unequal treaties. This is just another version of trying to humiliate or encircle or weaken China. Um, and of course, they're in a position not to take that anymore, probably militarily, but certainly economically.
Yeah. I mean, that, just to turn it around just slightly, but how much credence do you put into stories of Chinese IP theft and intelligence gathering and stirring up trouble, trying to kind of use this money to buy its way into industries and even governments around the world, being, in other words, an imperial power itself?
Yes, I mean, they always have been. And of course, China will never officially admit it, but it's never not been an imperial power, right? I mean, ask the Tibetans, ask the Uyghurs, ask people around the Korean border, ask people in other parts
Quite a
of.
few African countries are suddenly realizing that when you borrow money from China, it comes with some rather large strings attached.
Well, yeah, there's that kind of economic power and the entire Belt and Road initiative which has gone on, and also the Maritime Belt and Road, which is also taking place as well. So Chinese influence is everywhere. It's in ports around the world. That it is significant when you go to cities like where the earthquake just was, in Burma. Go through that area and you'll see massive Chinese influence. Um, on the other hand, what is, I mean, I'm not condoning that. And of course, it is imperialist and they should admit their own imperialism. There's a certain tendency in the way that it's sort of discussed to sort of think that imperialism is about going from one place across the sea to another place, right? But you can just kind of walk to that place and conquer it, right? As well, right? So that's kind of what China has done in terms of expanding its borders. Um, so I think that obviously is a problem. But of course, the Americans have decided after sort of moving a lot of production to China that they're now not happy about that and they want to get it back. And it's just like, well, hang on a minute, like you've outsourced all this to us. We're making the iPhones, we're making the Teslas, we're making these things. To be fair, you also outsourced your emissions to us as well. In half the time when I remember after the UK sold MG to China, Tony Blair saying, "Isn't it fantastic? We've got our emissions down by 0.5% or something in the Birmingham area or something like that." And that was but yeah, but you just move those emissions to China, right?
Yeah, I know. Well, there's been a lot of that, I'm afraid.
That kind of greenwashing and all the rest of it is sort of, you can understand why China gets a little bit annoyed by that sometimes.
But deep down, do you think there is a desire to dominate us, or just to be friends with us on a different basis, a more equal basis?
My feeling is not a desire to dominate or anything like that. And there's a lot of people in China, and I have a lot of conversations with people in China who are not very happy about the way the country's going. They certainly don't support the country's what would we call it? Quiet support for Putin, particularly.
Mm-hmm.
They're uneasy about that, and Ukraine. They're uneasy about the direction of the economy. They're uneasy about free speech. They're uneasy about Hong Kong, Taiwan, and many things. But on the other hand, there is a certain national pride, and that at the moment is very, very strong because it's taught in the education system, which is known as the sort of mother country love education system, and nationalism is reinforced at many, many levels. And of course, the reason they can enforce that nationalism so completely and so easily is that you only have to look at the history to see that they have no particular reason to trust any of us. And that is the legacy of empire in Anglo-Chinese or American-Chinese relations.
Golly. Well, actually, one thing I was sitting here thinking, if I do a second edition of my book, I've got to put something in about Hong Kong. It's such a great story, especially what happened in 45. Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your amazing knowledge and your brilliant pronunciation of Chinese words. So impressive.
Well, no, thank you very much. And I have to say again, if people are listening, I'll do the plug because you won't.
Oh, thank you. I did not ask him for this. Honestly,
no, but I obviously, when reading books like yours, I'm always thinking, how does that slot into research I'm doing? And the stuff on Bose, comparing him to sort of the complete lack of a leader or a theory or a support for an army like that in China, is the thing that immediately jumps out at me, that make those two giant Asian countries very, very different at this point in time.
Indeed. Many thanks for your time. See you on the circuit. Not at my book launch. I can't remember if you're coming.
You haven't sent me an invite, mate.
Surely I have. Oh, well, I will right now. See you soon, I hope, in the flesh. Bye.
Okay, take care.
Thank you, Paul, once again. I don't think anybody pronounces Chinese words quite as well as he does. At least not anybody who's not Chinese. Very impressive. Yeah, lots to think about. Hope you learn something. I often do. I think it's one of the reasons I do this podcast. I get to meet lots of interesting people and read lots of new books, which I get sent for free. And I get to talk to fascinating people. And next week, I am slightly keeping in the sort of area of the Second World War once again, I'm afraid. It's the book, isn't it? It's my book. But I'm talking to Tim Bouverie, who's also got a book out, a new book about the relationship between the big three: Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin. Endlessly interesting and often scandalous, very much analyzed relationship where what you saw on those photographs of them all beaming and smiling as they sat around and plotted the strategy to win the war and then to create the new world that would follow it. What you saw in the photographs often did not reflect the backstabbing, the suspicion, the intrigues behind the scenes, all the sort of things that I really like. And I think you do too. So Tim's got a new book about that and has things to say. And no doubt I'll get the excuse to slip in a few references to my own book, because it's sort of also about how it's not really about the high politics so much. It's about the imperial politics, I suppose I should say, of that moment from the British perspective. But of course, the Americans and the Soviets were also building empires of their own, even though they would not call them that. And Roosevelt had a long-standing opposition to the idea of empire, but that was softening in the latter months of the war, as I reveal in my book. And of course, when he dies, Truman comes in, very different attitudes, and America really does shift its position. So I should look forward to grilling Tim about that. and I'm sure he'll be an excellent guest. Hope you'll be with me next week too. In the meantime, if you fancy pre-ordering my book, I would love you to. There are links in the bio. You can. The Australian Amazon store has it. The British Amazon store has it. And if you're not British or Australian or New Zealand or Indian, you can probably get it. The best way would be to get it on ebook or the Audible. I've actually heard some of the audio. It's really good. In fact, I played a little clip at the end of last week's show, including an actress being my mother-in-law, because yes, she's in the book too. All right. Very much appreciate your company as ever. Thank you very much for listening or watching. See you next week. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.